Hi, everybody. Welcome back for week 5. This week, as I hinted at in week 4, what we're covering is controversy in the museum. We are going to look at 3 different articles, and normally I don't tell you the order to read articles in, but this week it is a little bit more important for you to read them in a particular order. So that's essentially, I'm going to cover the order and the reasons for why that's the case and give you some more background than what is necessarily in the sources I'm giving you. But we're looking at an article from Kahn in the Companion to Museum Studies ebook that's going to give us a general background of controversies in the museum in the last couple decades, contemporary issues, and then our other 2 readings will be directed towards a particular controversy surrounding the Enola Gay exhibit at the National Air and Space Museum at the Smithsonian. So to jump right in here, when we're talking about controversy in the museum, and in the Science Museum in particular, Kahn is going to ask us to essentially counteract some of the common narratives that we tend to have about science and the way that it tends to be depicted in the museum. Science typically in a public sphere tends to be depicted as something that is true and objective and non-controversial in a world where so many things are full of false claims and subjectivity and these gray areas that create controversy. Because science is based on data, there's an assumption that science can cut through all of those things and tell us the truth, which is a problematic statement, as we know as historians, right? To make a claim like we see from, a historian of science on the right, that science can be all of these wonderful things without any sort of engagement with the history of how science has been used, makes it difficult for us to have any sort of critical engagement with the impacts of science on society and the ways in which people interact with science. We know as historians that science has been used in controversial, subjective ways. We've already talked this semester about the history of scientific racism, the creation of things like phrenology. If you've done, other research on this topic or have learned about it in other courses, right? The Tuskegee experiments, for example, another example of racism infused into scientific analysis in our country's history. There are a lot of examples like this where we know that science doesn't have this sort of objective basis. In addition to that, there tends to be a belief that science is always good, and that it's always advancing us positively towards progress, which is a theme that we've already talked about as well this semester. And Kahn is going to talk about progress again here, and he's going to complicate that idea, right? And say that, of course, technology and science have done many wonderful things for us, but there are also many critiques that are happening in the public sphere as well that are not necessarily being engaged in a museum context. When we talk about a major issue, like we'll see with our example with the atomic bomb, for example, the public was certainly debating the uses and the benefits and the disadvantages and the fears over the creation of such a weapon, but museums have really failed to engage with that sort of concern on any sizable level. So when Kahn is talking about these issues, he's talking about a few different things that are taking place in museums currently, which for him, he's talking about, the 90s and 2000s, early 2000s period. So he's going to have some strong opinions in here that are certainly political opinions, but I want you to keep in mind, I will explain to you more of this context in a second. He is writing after the Enola Gay controversy. The Enola Gay controversy is in this article, and there were some sizable impacts on the historical community as a result of these controversies. And so keep that in mind when you read the article and why he may have written things in some of the manners that he did. But the key point that he's getting at when he's talking about these different controversies, which is not just about nuclear power, but it's about the relationship between Native American citizens in the United States and natural history museums, for example. All of these things tend to have a central question, which is who owns the past and how is that past presented? When we talk about museum institutions and we're talking about objects, it is literally true that somebody owns the past, right? Somebody has ownership of these materials and they choose to use them or not use them in certain ways. That being the case, right, it's worthwhile and important for us to question how these things are being used, which things are chosen to be used and which things are not, which things are chosen to be preserved and which things are not, which things are chosen to be presented and which things are not. And when those things are chosen to be presented, what order are they put in? What context are they put in? All of these things are important to consider when we think about the narratives that are presented in exhibits, and who is behind the creation of these exhibits. Because, as we know, historical knowledge and historical presentation is power, right? There's a reason why, there's the famous phrase of history going to the victors, right? You get to present the narrative if you have the power to present the narrative. When we're talking specifically about science, Kahn's concern here is that unlike other types of historical analysis done in a museum world, say you had an exhibit on military history, for example, and it was a topic like the Civil War, to which people still have many personal connections and strong personal opinions on, and we have many, people in the public realm that are really into military history, would feel confident on giving some sort of opinion or expertise on the topic. In comparison, science tends to be a topic or subject that a lot of people don't feel very confident about, even though we engage with it every day. So you would be able to have some level of knowledge of what a computer does, but you wouldn't necessarily with confidence be able to tell somebody else how a computer operates, right? How a hard drive would work, right? So that being the case, Kahn's argument is that because science is not objective, because it's embedded in current political debate and always will be, it has just like anything else in this world, is impacted and impacts our current, political, economic, social situations, that we need a higher level of science literacy in this country to help people better engage with issues that intersect with science, say something like climate change, right? So Kahn sees the museum as a world or a realm where we can teach people to engage better with the political world, because we don't tend to engage with science a whole lot unless that's something we majored in and get a job in after we get out of school, and may not be something that's interesting to us in a school environment as children either. So that being said, the reason we're focusing on this controversy, the Enola Gay, is because it is a watershed moment in the relationship between historians and the public in this political world, essentially in the history of the profession here in the United States. When you look at the other two sources, Thielen and Cohn, you'll notice that they're part of a larger issue from the Journal of American History that was entirely dedicated to this controversy in 1995, and the controversy happened throughout the previous years. Thielen is a historian, a public historian, who is going to give a general overview of the conflict and its effects on the history field, help you understand what was going on in this period. And then Cohn is going to have a particular connection to the Air Force, who's going to object to the exhibit and provide his own critique of how the exhibit operated. So you're going to get multiple perspectives here. when you read Cohn and Thielen, but Cohn really more so, use him to understand the history of the National Air and Space Museum and its mission as a key part or piece for why this exhibit ends up failing. And it's something to keep in mind as you think about a museum that you would want to do your own project at. Because just because there's a museum that's focused on your topic does not mean that they're focused on presenting your topic in the way that you would like to present your topic. And so, that being the case, as you'll see with this controversy, may not be the best fit for what you're trying to achieve. So, one of the major contexts for what's going on during this Enola Gay controversy is that it's part of what's known as the culture wars of the 1990s. And we could make the argument that the culture wars never really ended. We can see some of these similar debates, as you can tell from the political cartoons, still being debated today. Prayer in schools. The influence of Hollywood on society, abortion, gun control, all of these things that we tend to still feel like there's two sides on. And the two sides that are always represented in these debates in the public sphere is traditional or conservative values versus progressive or liberal values. And things are presented in the public sphere that you're on one side or the other, right? There's no real nuance between these two things. We can make the argument that this goes back to the Scopes trial and how people reacted to the role of Christianity and religion in relationship to science. But when James Davison Hunter writes a book on the culture wars is really when we come up with a term for this idea and its high level of influence in American politics. There are a few ways in which American history finds itself at the center of this debate. And it tends to be through the Smithsonian, which it becomes this representative of what American history is, with good reason, right? It's kind of the museum institution of the United States, and it's on the Mall in Washington, D.C. But some of the exhibits that the Smithsonian puts on at this time, as well as changing curriculum in public education, creates a situation where conservative politicians are going to present new interpretations of history as revisionist history. And this becomes essentially a battleground for what the United States is all about and whether we should celebrate American history or be critical of American history. Again, it's a very oversimplified debate because it's saying either you have to completely celebrate American history or you have to be completely critical of American history with no nuance in between. So the Smithsonian's National Museum of American Art is going to be the first major controversy for the Smithsonian in this period. And it's partly because the Smithsonian is being run by academic historians at this time, as you'll see in the Cohn article, that are concerned with taking more of an academic approach to doing Smithsonian-based exhibits. The problem with this is that academic historians didn't necessarily have experience working with the public before they started doing these projects. So the West is America, which was an exhibit using different artworks tied to westward expansion and Manifest Destiny in 1991. When you look at the slide, you can click on this link and it will actually show you everything that was in the exhibit. Became very controversial because it was a critical analysis of what Manifest Destiny meant in regards to race and to gender and to things that we typically discuss in an academic environment when we cover a topic like this. But for the public audience, it was very controversial at the time. If you're interested, definitely check out the way that the terminology was used. But we're more concerned with the Enola Gay, so we're going to jump over to that. The Enola Gay, which again, if you click on this link up here, you'll see that There is a pretty good resource that has a bunch of primary source material about what people were saying about it as it was being revised and decided on. I won't go over in depth what was happening in this exhibit because the sources you'll read will tell you, and I don't want this to get too long. But essentially, the Enola Gay exhibit is going to have a similar approach, very academic style approach, and then ultimately is unsuccessful because the Air Force will come in and make some critiques about how it's overly critical. And it was on the 50th anniversary of the end of the war, essentially. So there's a lot of concern with how things are going to be presented. But as soon as politicians become involved in this world and it jumps into the private realm, it becomes this huge ordeal because it gets to the point to where Congress is essentially calling for the heads of people who work for the Smithsonian and are ultimately successful at that. And the exhibit doesn't end up coming to fruition. So when we think about, the history profession and where the academic world tends to reside and what people are doing in the jobs that are, curatorial sort of jobs, it's something that, these people didn't really have to deal with until they were pushed into this political world. And so, Thielen, Cohn, and Kahn are all going to make the same argument, which is something that I think is an important argument, is that just because controversies happen doesn't mean we shy away from these controversies. The job of the public historian is to engage with them, right? Engage with the controversy, engage with the interest, and present it in a way that is actually usable and workable and something that we can actually put into a museum. And so when you look at this example, look at all the ways in which failures occurred so that the exhibit didn't come to fruition in the way that it should have, and it would have been beneficial to do, because everybody that you read in here is going to agree that it was a great exhibit, but there were some fundamental problems that prevented it from making its way into the public. And it's not just politicians, it's the ways in which choices were made to do the exhibit overall. So that's what you're going to engage with for the discussion post this week. Really briefly, I want to talk about the exhibit review guide. I will have already posted some information on this already, but you want to really, really try to visit an actual location. It's the only time I'm going to ask you to do this for this short semester. You're just not going to get the same level of engagement if you don't visit in person. If you absolutely cannot do that, I know everybody has different schedules and different situations. So if you can't, you need to do a virtual tour online. Don't do an online exhibit. There is a difference. A virtual tour is actually going to take you through the physical space, which is a necessary component of the assignment. So I did list some examples here for you to use. If you have any questions about that or any concerns, send me an email. Otherwise, I will see you back here for week 6.